Welcome to Village Church Connections. I'm David Pavey. We're hearing a lot about refugees and economic migrants these days. My wife Nancy and I spent a decade working amongst them in Great Britain before we moved to Shell Point, so it seems appropriate to devote a few moments on the subject today. One day in England, a refugee friend called me to say that his brother had just arrived at a freeway service station an hour north of us. Could I pick him up? Taking an Albanian with me to translate, I raced to the appointed place where a pathetic sight greeted me. 10 weary, disoriented, unshaven men. Most had no coats. Their shoes were in tatters. None of them spoke a word of English. And they had come from Turkey and the Balkans, having ridden the last stage of the journey hidden in the back of a truck from Brussels. Once the truck had stopped, the driver, who had been unaware of his human cargo, had called the police, who had registered and fingerprinted the weary passengers, had given them letters with orders to report to the immigration authorities in London, and then released them. So now they were illegal aliens, if you like. Legal until their request for asylum had been adjudicated, and they were given permission to remain or not. Not would mean that half of them would go underground. A few would be deported. It was agony for me to have to pull 2 out of that pathetic group and leave 8 of them there in the cold and darkness, struggling to contact a relative via phone or to find someone to give them a lift to who knows where. Refugees are pouring into Europe. Technically, a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his home country because of armed conflict or persecution. Well, Syrians, for example. 5 million refugees have fled from Syria to Turkey, Jordan, and elsewhere. Refugees should receive special consideration by receiving countries if declared to be genuine. An economic migrant, on the other hand, is someone who chooses to resettle in another country in search of a better life. For example, Nigerians who flee poverty and look for work in Europe. They fall under the receiving country's immigration laws. Over 65 million people around the world have been forced from home. That's the population of France. 2/3 of them are internally displaced within their own countries, but over 21 million are genuine refugees, more than the population of Florida, and more than half of these are under the age of 18. Economic migrants are also pouring into Europe. Total sea arrivals to Europe in 2015 was over 1 million, while nearly 4,000 died en route. 75% of them were women and children. There's no sign that this flow of African migrants will ever stop. Now let me introduce you to Samir, a refugee from Afghanistan. After a death-defying escape from the Taliban, Samir, aged 14, managed to cross into Iran, where border guards shot at him. He traversed Iran into Turkey and across Turkey, and there squeezed into a packed refugee boat for Greece. He then hid himself on trains across Europe until he finally staggered a few months ago into what is known as the jungle in Calais, across the English Channel from Britain. 10 months on, however, the final leg of the journey to the UK is proving the hardest of all. Calais is the end of the line for many refugees, and in many respects is a microcosm of the legal and political morass at the center of the world's biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War. Samir wants to reach his brother in London by sneaking aboard a truck headed across or under the English Channel in a nightly death-defying game of chicken with French or British police. More than 10,000 migrants live in the bleak, soggy, windswept area known as the jungle, 1,000 of them being unaccompanied minors like Samir. There are no UN relief organizations there, unlike the camps in Greece and Jordan and elsewhere. Legally, the jungle doesn't even exist. Now, Britain has started building a 13-foot wall in Calais to prevent all illegal access to the trucks and trains that use the 31-mile tunnel to Folkestone or the ferries. Moreover, the French Interior Minister has declared that France intends to demolish the jungle this year and disperse the refugees to small centres across France, a plan doomed to failure, as several French mayors have already stated they will not willingly accept the refugees, and the migrants will return to Calais anyway, determined to get to the UK. London, meanwhile, is scrambling to grant special permission to allow unaccompanied minors with relatives in Britain to immigrate from the jungle before the French bulldozers do their work. Across Europe, hundreds of thousands of people are trapped in various forms of legal purgatory, waiting for labyrinthine asylum procedures to take their course, or scrambling to find legal loopholes, while governments argue over how many of them they will accept as refugees. Samir is now 16. I wonder how his story will unfold. Will he be able to join his brother in London? Some churches and charities across Europe and in North America are doing good work to help refugees to resettle and to introduce them to the gospel. In Calais, an Assemblies of God church has been ministering to the so-called jungle. Their work received national attention recently, however, when much of their building was burned to the ground, apparently by arsonists. In Britain, numerous churches are doing what they can to reach out to migrants. My wife Nancy and I devoted a decade to such work in Luton, near London, and now one of the converts is spearheading a ministry to immigrants in the centre of that town, under the auspices of an evangelical church. In Germany, numerous churches are reaching out to refugees. The village church at Shell Point has given generously to support the work of an Arabic-speaking missionary couple who are reaching out to Syrian refugees in Berlin. Others are doing good work in Rome, Athens, Amman, Beirut, Toronto, Vancouver, Minneapolis, and other cities in our own country. National governments determine immigration policy. But Christians need to see the presence of migrants, whether refugees or migrant workers, as an opportunity rather than a threat. An opportunity to show kindness and share the good news of Jesus and his love. Oh yes, Jesus. What would Jesus do relative to migrants? I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home, he said. Hear the words of Moses. The Lord your God shows love to the foreigners living among you and gives them food and clothing. So you too must show your love to foreigners. How do you think we're doing on that score? And thank you for tuning in once again to Village Church Connections.